By late November 1944, the romanticized, triumphant crusade of the Allied liberation of Europe had died. It was buried somewhere in the freezing, blood-soaked mud of the Lorraine campaign and the impenetrable concrete bunkers of the Siegfried Line. For the men of General George Patton's Third Army, the war had devolved from a glorious armored sprint across France into an apocalyptic meat grinder. The weather was the worst Europe had seen in half a century. Freezing rain turned the battlefields into oceans of icy sludge. Men were living in waterlogged foxholes, their uniforms rotting off their bodies. Trench foot, pneumonia, and dysentery were inflicting more casualties than German artillery. But the greatest threat to the American war effort wasn't the German Wehrmacht, and it wasn't the freezing cold. It was a silent, invisible epidemic that was hollowing out the ranks from the inside. It was despair. Psychiatrists called it combat fatigue. The GIs called it the 1,000-yard stare. It was the terrifying psychological state where a soldier simply stopped caring if he lived or died. The constant, relentless barrage of 88mm shells, the sight of their friends being blown to pieces, and the sheer, exhausting misery of the freezing mud had stripped the humanity from them. They were no longer fighting to win. They were just waiting to die. Patton understood this psychological cliff better than any commander in the Allied forces. He knew that an army could survive without food, without sleep, and without ammunition. But an army without a soul was already dead. And on a miserable, sleet-swept morning near a battered French staging area, Patton was about to confront a battalion of broken men and deliver a terrifying, electric warning that would remind them exactly what kind of monsters they needed to become to survive. An infantry battalion of the 90th Division, the Tough Ombers, had just been pulled off the front line. They had been chewed to pieces in brutal house-to-house fighting. They had lost their officers, they had lost their sergeants, and they had lost their nerve. They were assembled in a muddy field, waiting for hot rations that were delayed. They stood with their shoulders slumped, their heads down, shivering violently in their wet wool coats. Nobody was talking. Nobody was cleaning their weapons. They were a collection of ghosts, hollow-eyed farm boys from Texas and Oklahoma who had been ground down into empty shells. Then, the blare of a Jeep siren cut through the freezing rain. General George S. Patton's command vehicle, flanked by military police on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, roared into the encampment. The contrast was jarring, almost insulting. Patton stepped out into the mud wearing his immaculate cavalry breeches, a highly polished helmet adorned with 3 oversized stars, and his signature ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. He looked like a god of war descending upon a graveyard. Patton's staff expected him to offer the men a few words of comfort. They expected him to promise them hot food, new boots, and a long rest in the rear. But as Patton walked down the ranks of the shattered battalion, looking into their dead, defeated eyes, his face hardened. He didn't see boys who needed a blanket. He saw an American combat unit that was embracing victimhood. And to Patton, embracing victimhood was a terminal disease. Patton ordered his driver to pull his Jeep into the center of the formation. He didn't ask for a microphone. He didn't use a podium. He climbed onto the hood of the Jeep, standing tall amidst the freezing sleet, and looked out over the sea of shivering, miserable men. When he spoke, his voice wasn't warm or fatherly. It was a high-pitched, abrasive whip crack that demanded absolute attention. "I have been looking at your faces," Patton barked, the sound carrying over the howling wind. "And I see men who look like whipped dogs. I see men who are feeling sorry for themselves. I see men who are waiting for the Germans to put them out of their misery." A shockwave rippled through the freezing ranks. The GIs, exhausted and traumatized, looked up. This wasn't the speech they expected. Patton leaned forward, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "You look at this mud, and you look at your dead friends, and you think you are victims. You think this war is something that is happening to you." Patton paused, letting the silence hang in the freezing air. "You have forgotten who you are. You have forgotten where you come from." What followed was a masterclass in psychological reconstruction. Patton didn't appeal to their sense of duty or democracy. He appealed to their primal ancestral pride. He was going to strip away the trauma and replace it with pure, unadulterated aggression. "You are Americans," Patton roared. "Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans." He pointed a gloved finger at a young, shivering rifleman in the front row. "You men are not victims. Your grandfathers crossed a wilderness, fought Indians, starved, and bled to build a country out of dirt. You come from a bloodline of brawlers and conquerors. You are the most lethal, heavily armed, and dangerous creatures on the face of this earth. And right now, you are standing around feeling sorry for yourselves while a bunch of kraut bastards are sitting in warm bunkers laughing at you." Patton was pacing the hood of the Jeep now, his voice dripping with venom. He was systematically destroying their despair by turning it into rage. "I don't want you to die for your country," Patton famously echoed his core philosophy. "I want you to make the other poor, dumb bastard die for his country. You are not here to survive. You are here to kill. You are here to rip the living guts out of the German army and use them to grease the treads of our tanks." The transformation in the field was palpable. The men who had been staring at the mud were now staring directly at the general. The shivering hadn't stopped, but the posture had changed. Jaws were clenching. Fists were tightening around the stocks of M1 Garens. Patton concluded his speech by looking them dead in the eyes and delivering a final, chilling mandate. "When you go back into the line, I don't want you digging in. I don't want you holding. We are not holding anything except the enemy by the nose. We are going to hold him by the nose, and we are going to kick him in the ass. Now remember who you are. Remember what you are. You are the vanguard of the United States Army. Now act like it." Patton stepped down from the Jeep. He didn't wait for a salute. He got into his vehicle and drove away, leaving the battalion standing in the rain. But they weren't ghosts anymore. Patton's brutal, unsympathetic words had acted like a psychological defibrillator. He had violently reminded them that they possessed agency. They weren't just targets waiting for artillery. They were hunters. Within 48 hours, that same shattered battalion of the 90th Division was ordered back into the meat grinder. They didn't just hold their sector. They launched a ferocious, unyielding counterattack that cracked a massive hole in the German defensive line. They fought with a viciousness that terrified the German defenders. This incident is a perfect distillation of Patton's controversial approach to leadership and combat psychology. While other generals, like Omar Bradley, were known as the soldier's general, men who showed empathy and paternal care, Patton believed that empathy in combat was a death sentence. Patton's philosophy was brutally pragmatic. If you allow a soldier to dwell on his misery, his brain will shut down and he will die. The only way to inoculate a man against the terror of war is to convince him that he is more terrifying than the war itself. By telling his men they had forgotten who they were, Patton was engaging in an extreme form of identity politics. He was demanding that they embrace a hyper-aggressive, almost mythical version of American masculinity. He was telling them that fear was an insult to their ancestors. Decades later, Patton's methods remain a lightning rod for debate among psychologists and military historians. The critics argue that Patton's approach was deeply toxic. They argue that his refusal to acknowledge the legitimate psychological trauma of his men, dismissing combat fatigue as cowardice or forgetting who you are, caused irreparable mental damage. By forcing traumatized men to suppress their fear and replace it with manufactured rage, critics argue Patton created a generation of veterans who were fundamentally broken inside, unable to process the horrors they had witnessed. They view his speeches as the tyrannical demands of a sociopath who viewed his men as mere instruments of his own glory. The supporters, however, counter that a battlefield is not a therapist's office. They argue that in the absolute hell of the Lorraine campaign, surrounded by death and freezing mud, a warm blanket and a sympathetic ear wouldn't have saved those men. It would have gotten them killed. Supporters view Patton's shock therapy as a brilliant, desperately needed psychological intervention. By aggressively reminding his troops of their lethality, He replaced their paralyzing fear with a survival-driven anger. To his supporters, Patton's refusal to let his men be victims is exactly what broke the back of the German army and ended the war. George S. Patton believed that the mind was the ultimate weapon of war. If a man believed he was a victim, he would die like a victim. But if a man believed he was an unstoppable conqueror, he would tear down the gates of hell itself. In a muddy field in 1944, Patton proved that sometimes the only way to save a man's life is to terrify him into remembering how to fight. What do you think? Was Patton's brutal speech a masterpiece of psychological warfare that saved his men? Or was it a toxic, unsympathetic demand that ignored the genuine trauma of a brutal war? Did his troops need comfort, or did they need an awakening? Let us know your verdict in the comments below. The debate over how we treat the minds of our soldiers is as relevant today as it was in 1944, and we want to read your perspective. If you want more raw, unfiltered dives into the psychological grit of World War II, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for WW2 History Hub.